literature in jazz, music, film. IAAC brings all of that to you. I won't go over it because you can hear all day and you've heard the story all day long. You might think I'm wearing this to honor Dr. Guy's exceptional work. His work is exceptional, right about that. But I'm wearing this because I'm going to the Diwali party right now. This is rare. So, Dr. Guy also needs no introduction. He is Florence and Herbert Irving, I do need to read their names, curator of Arts of South and Southeast Asia at the Metropolitan Museum of New York. He's an elected fellow of so many organizations, but he spent 24 years at Victoria and Albert Museum preparing for his role at the Met. He is well known by all in this field. Anybody who's in the art field knows him. And one of the things he's done, his latest project, and I won't go through everything he's written because he's written quite a bit and you can Google it. But one of the things he's done that is truly remarkable is his latest project, which is The Tree and Serpent, devoted to the exploration of the early Buddhist art in the Deccan. All of us who grew up in India assume that somehow Buddhism flew from North India to Sri Lanka and really with no on wings. But actually that is not the case. There are some magnificent pieces of sculpture and seen for the very first time. So not only is he a detective in the art world, collects Buddhist art with the Hellenized world and the Roman world and South and Southeast Asia, but he's also a diplomat. To get those works, magnificent sculptures from India, from the different museums, takes diplomacy of a very high order. So thank you so much for this field. And let me just give you quotes from two people. One from Dalrymple. One of the most striking shows the Met has put on in a long time. And this is from Colin Cotter. He said, New York Times. We haven't seen such a display of ancient art from India on this scale in years and are unlikely to see it for some time. So you have to get this book. This is a magnificent book which has all of these sculptures in it. You can get it from Amazon. You can get it from the Metropolitan. There's also a Maple Indian edition, which by the way, this is just a magnificent book. I cannot recommend it more. And it's just the kind of work that you want to see done. It's a very unique one. And he will engage, Dr. Guy, sorry, he's not the French version. He will engage in a conversation with Joshin. Joshin O'Roy is the Vice President in charge of tax salary on 57th Street. It is on 57th. Yeah. And it's a magnificent place. If you haven't been there, and I expect 90% of you have been there already, it's just a marvelous gallery with wonderful collections of artwork, including some of your the group that you have a particular affinity for, which is women artists. So if you haven't been there, I urge you to go. And meanwhile, Dr.
John is going to do a short presentation on the book, after which we'll engage in a Q&A and then open it up to the audience. So I'm going to hand it over to you, John.
Thank you, Giselle. Welcome, everyone. What I want to do in this relatively short time we have is talk a little bit about the exhibition. I probably should do a straw poll and ask those who've seen the exhibition to raise their hands. This is gratifying indeed, thank you. The bad news is it closed last Sunday, having had a 4-month run, but is having a second iteration at the National Museum of Korea in Seoul. We'll be there for another 4 months before returning to Delhi, and then dispersed to the various lenders. I should perhaps begin by, I have rather a substantial PowerPoint. I think that may be a little bit too ambitious for the time frame we have. So let me just talk a little bit about what the exhibition is and is not in the publication. The exhibition itself, it was not concerned, there was no special desire to do an exhibition of standard Buddhist images, the A to Z of Buddhism, which has been done many times, even in the Indian context, beginning in Mathura, taking a little side trip up to Peshawar Valley in Pakistan, to Sarnath, to South Bihar, and so on. The familiar territory of the greater Magadha region where the Buddha lived and taught. That territory is foundational to the study of Dalai Buddhist art. It's also a very well-trodden path. And what we wanted to do at the Met was to add to the narrative, to expand people's understanding of the origins of Buddhist art. My vision was to create an exhibition which would make sense of the religious landscape which existed in the 5th century, when a young prince was born in Kapilavastu, the Sakya clan's capital, in northern, what's today northern UP, bordering on western Nepal. What was that religious landscape? We just heard from the previous speaker very erudite presentations on the profound and ancient Vedic traditions of India, of course, which are so foundational for modern day Hinduism. But I should also raise the issue that when this young prince made this seismic decision to leave the palace, leave his position and inheritance, his wife and a newborn son, depart the palace at night, go into the woods, perform the tonsor, discard his clothes for soiled rags, and become a wandering mendicant, a wisdom seeker. What did he discover on day 2 when he woke up in the forest? And of course he didn't meet many Brahmins, I think, chanting Vedas, or necessarily. What he would have met were shrines dedicated to nature spirits, to the yakshas, the nagas, the yakshis, the naginis. These were the living landscape of early India, and as all of you will know, have never departed India. They're still a part of that living landscape today. And so I was very conscious when we look at early Buddhist art, and we begin the story with a wonderful 2nd century realized Buddha from Mathura, or a 3rd century standing Buddha from Amaravati. That's presented as if that's the beginning of the narrative. And it struck me that there were 400 years that precede that in which the Buddha is not represented iconically at all. There is no icon, no image of the Buddha really until the 2nd century in the north, early 3rd century in the south. And the conventional wisdom now is the Buddha probably died around the year 400 BCE. So between 400 BCE and around 200 Common Era, it's a very long stretch of time in terms of the foundations of Buddhism, and the Buddha is completely absent in human form for all those centuries. He's there, of course, but he's there in an iconic form, in signs and symbols, auspicious marks, ways in which his presence is evoked. And so much of the exhibition was devoted precisely to that, and examine this in the book, tease out these ideas to get an understanding of the foundations of Buddhism, and the way in which the Buddha, as a wisdom seeker, had to navigate that religious landscape and accommodate these very powerful local deities, the nature spirit cults, And their power is self-evident when you look at the early Buddhist art. When we talk of early Buddhist art, of course, what we mean is the art of adornment of the stupa. This is the principal monument, the funerary mound to house the relics, central to Buddhist devotion. And the adornment of the stupa, which evolved over time. When the 8 rulers of Magadha all stormed up to Kapilavastu and demanded their share of the relics and took them back hastily on the backs of elephants to their kingdoms and interred them in a stupa. It's probably part of a mound of earth, a tumuli. Over time, these were rebuilt, solid core brick structures, and in due course embellished with sculptural decoration. So that whole process would have happened over several centuries, it's what is remarkable is the way in which the relics of the Buddha were in turn distributed, particularly through the interventions of Emperor Ashoka in the mid-3rd century, widely across the Mauryan kingdom. And this was a key moment in terms of spreading the teachings of Buddhism and propagating the faith and so on. So let me just take you through a few images to give you a sense of what the exhibition looked like and the arguments that are contained in the book itself. So the territory we're talking about is essentially known to all of you and it extends from the Konkan coast on the west, the Arabian Sea, right through to the Bay of Bengal. This is a territory that the Satavahanas came to control over a number of centuries. They didn't control it all at one time, but they expanded their power and at their peak around the 2nd century Common Era had all these traits of land under their command. Both of this central region is of course dominated by the river systems, the Tapi and others which flow west, and the Godavari and the Krishna that flow east. And these provide, of course, networks and trade systems, of course, as well. So this landscape that the Buddha encountered was essentially one represented by these shrines. We have the great images, monumental images of yakshas and yakshis as freestanding figures which would have been venerated in open shrines, almost certainly. No structural monuments at this point. And the figure on the right from Vesnagar from Vidisha Museum, almost certainly the figure of Manibhadra, worshipped by merchants as the personification of wealth. And his companion, of course, was Kabera, who has prevailed down into modern times. But Manibhadra was there at the very beginning and named in a number of inscriptions. So when we first see the Buddha's presence being evoked in the decoration of these stupa railings and so on, there's a section, 2 posts from the Vedika which would create the enclosure pathway, the production of pata, the circumambulation passage, and the Buddha's presence is clearly indicated. You have the empty throne represented here by this very simple rectangle, evoking the throne upon which the Buddha's site of meditation is marked, the Vajrasana in Bodh Gaya, and in this instance also by the Buddhapada with the Dhammachakra decoration. The one on the right also invokes the story of the Naga Mukhalinda who rescued the Buddha during a great storm. Many of you know the story, and that's confirmed by a Brahmi inscription here, which actually names the snake as Mukhalinda. And on the right, the donor inscription from a female monastic from a nun. The Satavahanas were very enterprising. In many ways, I contest in the book that their significance in terms of the early economy of Mauryan India moving into the early Common Era was arguably more important than that of the Kushanas. The Kushanas we always think dominating northern India and the connections into Central Asia, which of course is true. But the great wealth that flowed into the Deccan, primarily triggered by the control of maritime trade on the 2 coasts, on the west coast and on the Bay of Bengal. Particularly, this trade goes back very early, of course, to the contacts with Achaemenid Iran in the 5th and 4th centuries at the peak of the Mauryan period, and then it continues, of course, into the Common Era with this new boom of trade taking place between the Satavahanas and Imperial Rome, the 1st, 3rd century Mediterranean world. And that trade became enormously important. And there are lots of little archaeological bits and pieces, coins, clay ceilings and so on, which give you a sense of the importance of those ships being represented on Satavahana coins, an important indicator. The earliest stupas themselves almost certainly were very modest structures. Stupa, the Sanskrit from tupa, the Pali, really essentially only refers to a mound of earth. But then decorated in elaborate ways. One of the finest in the south that still survives is Chandavaram, represented on the screen here, and above one of the very earliest depictions in which we see representation of what looks like 3 dakshinapatas, three pathways for circumambulating the stupa. And what you're doing is you're putting yourself in close proximity to the relics, which are understood to be housed within. Sanchi too is one of the best preserved railings that survive. The stupa has been heavily restored. And all of these stupas contained significant deposits of relics. And we were able in the exhibition, we were very privileged in many ways with this exhibition, but we secured original relics from relic containers from the Sanchi area, and we also had original relic offerings which have the status of contact relics from Pipraha, a site in northern UP. And the Pipraha relics we'll come to later, but simply to mention they were found in association with bone matter and an inscription stating that they were the corporeal remains of the Buddha. Now this site is 10 or 12 miles south of Lumbini. Okay, so it's extremely close proximity to the place of the Buddha's birth, which was confirmed in 1897 by inscriptions that were discovered by the Nepalese, and then in 1898 an estate manager at Pipraha excavated a mound assumed to be a stupa, it proved to be the case, and produced the most important relic discovery of the century. And this was a moment when archaeology in India, this Buddhist archaeology, was very, what I call stupa archaeology. It was really, there was some preoccupied with the stupas, not looking at the wider devotional landscape. Stupas, of course, are central to any monastic complex, but they're not the whole story. There are assembly halls, the preaching halls, the image houses, and of course the monastic quarters for living, for everyday life, all of that. So the discovery of these relics really was very, very significant. I show you the fact that many sites will have multiple relics, not just the one in the heart of in the stupa. So Amaravati, for example, on the left of the screen, they found, I think, over 10 or 12 relic containers from different locations, both within the core and then within the IAAC platforms, the 4 projecting platforms, which were added very much a southern feature. Sopara, it's more or less suburban Mumbai these days, I guess. A very important port city in the Konkan coast, the site where the famous sandalwood trader Purna, who celebrated in the Purna Avadana stories, where he operated and traded, became a connoisseur of sandalwood, made a fortune, and converted his wealth into Buddhist merit by gifting all of his wealth to the monastery in Sopara. That was excavated in the 1890s, and these are the relics that were found. Now I understand in the Asiatic Society in Mumbai. The Sanchi reliquaries here, and displaying of relics. And we featured this in the exhibition, in which we had some extraordinary panels from Andhra Pradesh, from Dupadu, in which we see the relics fully on display. You see the detail here. Sanchi, of course, is the most famous preserved site, but there were many, many others, and we tried to feature in the publication two of the most important recent discoveries in Buddhist archaeology in India. One is the site of Panagiri, close by to Hyderabad, 2-hour drive, excellent road, and the other is Kandalahalli in northern Karnataka. And both of these have really transformed our understanding of the stylistic range that existed in early Buddhist art. Just a glimpse of the exhibition itself. This is the way we installed the relics, created the walkway, so the visitor, in order to see the relic offerings, was obliged to do the circumambulation, so they have that experience. We have a Sangha here in New York, a branch of a Sri Lankan monastery, and they're stationed out in Queens, very conveniently, and we asked the monks to bless the exhibition and also for permission to record the chanting of sutras. So as you entered this space, you would hear the chanting of the word of the Buddha, as preserved in the Pali tradition of Sri Lanka, which is as close as we'll ever get to the lost Buddhist tradition of Andhra Desa, of ancient Andhra. So we came close, so to speak. The Pipraha relics. I used to say in my gallery exhibition tours, Tiffany window display. These are tiny little pieces of beautifully worked gemstones, pearls, shell, rock crystal, and so on. Each of those items were gifted by an individual seeking merit for themselves and for their family. This deposit had not been disturbed. The archaeology tells us this, had not been disturbed since around 200 BCE. So these are very close. We're talking 200 years after the Buddha's passing. This is historical terms, it's not very long ago. Ashoka was there, probably a generation earlier at this site. So this is sort of material where we're able to bring together and to show you the reconstruction, a model as well of a stupa. And the site itself is preserved today. The ASI have excavated, did an excellent job in the 1970s, excavating the monastic complex associated with the original stupa. And on the right are the original plan drawings prepared by the excavator in 1898. Just some of the site during excavation. 19th century archaeology was a little bit brutal. So when you go to investigate a stupa, you put a trench straight through. And that's what you see here. Okay? And go to the core, and when you're at ground level, within the core, but ground level outside, that's where you'll generally find the relics. Sure enough, there they were, still embedded in original Mauryan flat bricks, large, flat, thin bricks, very distinctive. Hadn't been rebuilt in post-Mauryan times. So I think I'll stop here and we'll discuss a little bit more and then take questions. I'm very conscious of time. I could go on for an hour, but the time won't permit.
Is the mic on again? Okay, there we go. Thank you, John. Thank you for the overview of the exhibition. I have to say, I did see the exhibition a few weeks back, and it was the most incredible experience. I think even as somebody with an art history background, there was much to discover. So thank you for that. Unfortunately, unfortunate timing, it closed last weekend. But I think what we do have in place of that is that incredible book. I have been devouring it, reading through it in the last few weeks. And I think what I'd really love to delve into to begin with is the question of scholarship. often I think scholarship can lead to exhibitions, but I think what really struck me was, it seemed to me that there was a gap in terms of scholarship in sort of early Buddhist art in southern India. And so I was wondering if you could speak to that, like is that something you encountered, and what sort of led your interest to that area?
Certainly, yes. It was, those of us who've taken an interest in early Buddhism in India, I think there was a growing awareness that the Satavahanas were really being treated as a footnote to the Kushanas, and the art which resulted from that, produced under their reign, was generally pretty marginalized. So it's not to deny the importance of the north. Of course, the whole greater Magadha region, the Gangetic Valley region, is absolutely central. These are the territories in which the Buddha traversed in his lifetime, of course. He didn't venture south, but it's quite clear that relatively quickly after his passing, his relics did. His corporeal remains did travel and were distributed widely, and stupas were built in Dakshinapata and those regions to the south, spreading his teachings. So when I was conceptualizing the exhibition, I very much wanted to bring the foreground a whole range of Buddhist art that's essentially not on people's radars to a large degree. There's material sitting in smaller museums in Andhra Pradesh and Telangana, the two principal regions, but elsewhere, as Maharashtra and other places as well. And to present a different narrative, present one which celebrates the Satavahanas and the Svakus, and spanning from the 1st BC to around the 4th century, and some of the unique Buddhist art they produced.
Stylistically, do you find sort of differences, or what are, I'm sure there are, what are the differences between sort of the visual culture and stylistic differences in the narratives that you found in this region, especially since I know some of the sculptures are being shown for the first time, between that and the Magad region? Could you kind of elaborate on that?
Sure, yes, very much. There's an almost stylistic range, of course. The iconography is pretty standard. One room we devoted entirely to the aniconic representations, in which this is discussed in some detail in the book, the ways in which the Buddha is represented in these symbolic ways, with the Buddhapada, with the riderless horse for the great departure, the wheel for the teachings, and so on. The way stylistically, the way they're represented varies a lot, and there's a range of factors to do with that, which I won't go into in detail here. There's partly also materials that in the south they work predominantly in limestone as opposed to the northern sandstone, widely available, and that produces a different aesthetic as well. But I think in terms of the stylistic origin, you can point to the single most important monument is probably Bahut, dated to around 150 BCE. Many of you will have been to the Indian Museum in Calcutta, and they have a very large room in which the enclosure, the surviving elements of the enclosure railing are beautifully installed. That material was moved in the 1880s from Bahut on bullock carts to Calcutta and installed in the late 19th century, and an extraordinary monument. The style evident in that becomes a pan-Indian style in the south, and other styles grow out of that, particularly Kandalahali, which is, as I say, is a news site near Gulbarga, and also the later material, Panagiri.
Are these sites open to visitors, just out of curiosity? Because I know you've sort of recent excavations of these sites from where these relics have been found in the stupas. Are these are they sort of in a preserved form that will be accessible to visitors? And
the exhibition was probably the best way to access much of this material in truth.
Yeah.
The Panagiri site you can visit freely. The sculptural material from the site has been removed for security and is in a go-down facility. So that is not immediately accessible. Kandalahali, which is the greatest Sanati area, if you're familiar with that, and Gulbarga is under ASI administration. That they did an extensive excavation, an excellent publication, it's been well documented and well recorded, but is not yet accessible to a wider public. You actually need a letter from the DG of Archaeology in Delhi, of course, and then you present yourself in Karnataka armed with your letter, and you have access. So it's rather limited. So the exhibition provided a rare opportunity to see much of this.
It was, and I was speaking to John earlier, and he told me that they had 220,000, am I right, visitors to the exhibition over the period of its opening. So I think that deserves a round of applause. I think especially, and I think coming back to sort of circling back to my first question, I do feel, I see this opening up the field of research and scholarship tremendously for this. And so when you were commissioning essays, because the book has about, I think, 10 or 11 contributors. And I think what's incredible about the book is that there are sort of general essays with overviews that's very accessible to anyone walking in that does not have sort of a background or familiarity. And then there's also very specific specificities of this period and of the exhibition and of the objects. And I think that's very special about the book. So I do hope you all have a look at it. So circling back to that, what was that sort of, how did you approach the commissioning of these essays?
Okay, well, yes, so the book is both a collection of essays and the catalogue entries.
Right.
I was very concerned. I think we're at a point in art history terms, it's probably true of many disciplines, that you cannot really dig into a subject with sufficient depth from one perspective alone. And so I was very conscious of inviting, the need to invite people who are doing specialist work in related areas. So I have to say that the field of early Buddhist studies in southern India is rather small. It's a small niche area of scholarship, and we were able to get almost everybody who's involved in this field to contribute short essays. So this sort of adds value, I think, and we produce our publications very much with a student readership in mind, that these will become standard textbooks for teaching and for dissemination. We ensured that this publication was simultaneously released in India with an Indian publisher, and has had wide coverage in the Indian media the last few months. And that's a
popular Diwali gift.
Yes.
Apparently, it's been a popular Diwali gift in India amongst families and connoisseurs.
That was wonderful news. So it's reaching a lot of people, in short, and that's essentially our mission as a museum. I think ways in which we can shift the narrative. I think we then had a 2-day symposium, 300 plus both days, attending that, and plus live streaming. And that was a way in which we could bring in additional voices. We had 5 speakers from India and some from Europe and elsewhere. A very, very productive dialogue took place there. So the ways in which we can push the field is institutions like the Met have capacity and therefore have responsibility to contribute in ways that really expand our understanding of the past. So doing safe exhibitions is not really what we should be doing. We should be taking risks, and we should be pushing into areas of scholarship which have not really been opened up to any substantial way before.
I think the exhibition definitely achieves that, and the book more so. If you just sort of walk into the exhibition, and I know you've touched upon that, that's the central premise of the exhibition is the absence of the Buddha. So I think when you walk through the exhibition, it was only in the last sort of exit room, so to speak, that you really see the iconic Buddha figure. So in terms of the iconography, I know it's coming back to the basics, but why the tree and the serpents?
Okay, well, the title Tree and Serpent really crystallized in my mind as the selection of the exhibition moved along. And it was very clear that if there are two ubiquitous motifs that prevail in southern Buddhist imagery, it is that of the Naga protecting the relics, but protecting the Buddha in his lifetime, self-appointed guardians of the relics after his passing. You see them entwined, almost affectionately wrapped, knotted around the drum and the dome of the stupa itself, and stories relating to all of that. And of course the tree, which in the first instance, of course, is the Bodhi tree, the wisdom tree marking the enlightenment moment. But it's more than that. It's also the wish-fulfilling tree. It's the ancient pre-Buddhist concept of the tree shrine, which permeates the Indian landscape. And we have this extraordinary image, again, Indian Museum, Calcutta, entrance hall. They have the great wish-fulfilling 2-meter-high monolithic stone from the Vidisha region, extraordinary object in which this great guarded tree is represented three-dimensionally, and around the roots of the tree are pots of money, sacks of money, conchs disgorging coins, and so on. It's all about boon giving, if you like, and no different to the trees you see in any town you walk through today, or the grounds of a temple, in which you'll see a tree with puja powders around the base, ribbons tied to the trunk, offerings being made. This is a continuum which is unbroken.
I think that was wonderful. Is there, well, I think because, early Buddhist art is storytelling. That is sort of the central, I think it's not only how it was spread, but it's also the central premise of the early religion. So I think to see that represented in the exhibition and in the book, because I think, like John said, it's a beautifully illustrated book as well, I think it's one of the first times I've seen an exhibition so representing it so completely. Does the iconic Buddha, at what point does that actually appear? Does it appear in this region? Is there a particular timeline?
Well, yes, so the Buddha appears in human form in the south around 300 Common Era, give or take. And we get him in Nagarjunakonda, late phase Pandagiri and other sites. Nagarjunakonda is the most famous site. Wonderful panels on loan from the Site Museum in the exhibition, or discussed in the book. It happens a little earlier in the north, somewhere in the 150, 200, that sort of window, as best we can tell. But it's a marvelous sort of moment when the Buddha is fully revealed, and then the underlying shifts, the shift of ideas that are taking place that underpin this. We don't, to this day, really fully understand why the Buddha was not represented in human form earlier. The sculptural skills are all there, of course, from the very beginnings, but there were clearly theological reasons that made this inappropriate. And then at some point, that thinking shifted. That is not discussed in any of the texts. There's no explanation offered as to why that is the case. We can speculate. I have my theory, and others do as well. But essentially, I suspect it's to do with the rise of popular Hinduism, and the essential bhakti element of devotionalism of Hinduism, which was very appealing, very powerful. I think the Buddhists found themselves in a defensive posture. I think they were losing support, because Buddhism only survives, only exists by virtue of the support of the community around them. The food they eat, the structures, of course, funded by the merchant and craft guild communities, very prosperous under the Satavahanas. That was the wealth which funded these monumental, spectacular monumental structures. I mean, the biggest architectural monuments on the ancient Indian landscape. There was nothing comparable to a stupa of the 1st century BCE, nothing. We don't see substantial Brahmanical temples for another 300 or 400 years at least. It's a major moment.
Thank you. I mean, I do want to leave some time for audience questions. Just one last quick question would be, what's the timeline been for the exhibition? I mean, an institutional show, I mean, I read you started your research in 2014. So
timeline to develop it?
To develop it. Just
okay,
loads of research,
okay.
You know, it's a monumental task.
Sure, yeah. These exhibitions always have a long gestation period. You can say it's, takes a lifetime, that's glib, but the field work for this began about 10 years ago in terms of spending time in the regions, just being on the road for weeks on end, going to all the sites, visiting the storage facilities wherever one could, and then you're building up an understanding of the corpus. From that you can distill the selection, then you begin the business of knocking on people's doors and saying, we'd like to borrow something, please, and building the bridges from that point when they say absolutely not, to the point where you secure agreement, and that takes several years.
Should be like Ram said, you are a diplomat as much as a curator, so it's very true. I open it up to the audience. I see a lot of hands up, so should we start with the
I have a question. You talked about representation of form. Now we know in Hinduism, when you go back to Ashtadhyayi or Mahabhashya or Patanjali, which is 150 BCE, that Hindu gods were already represented, both Utsav murtis that could be carried, or murtis which are worshipped in temples. So there is a big gap then, 500 BC or 400 BC of Parani and 300 CE that you have mentioned. So that is one question. The other point about serpent representation. We do know Patanjali, who in the Indian tradition is supposed to be both of the yoga and Mahabhashya and Ayurveda, is represented with the lower part as a snake. And Patanjali was from Kashmir, and the cult of the Naga is very important in Kashmir. Is the bedrock on which the Naga religion is done. And in fact, as one growing up here, I know it firsthand. And so, how do you find these interconnections? And because that as a research thing, interconnections between one aspect and the other aspect. And we see that in Kashmir, for example, the Kashmiri arts being evolved into Western Himalayan, after Kashmir became Islamicized, into both Buddhist kind and the Hindu kind in Nepal and in Kangra and so on. So perhaps there is a possibility if one explored further, even here, to bring in connections with other art prior to this in West of India.
Let me point two points just to respond to that. When Queen Maya gave birth to the Buddha in the Lumbini Gardens, standing, we're told, clutching the branches of the tree, which is flowering, her first act was then to go to the family shrine, Kapilavastu, and present the newborn infant to the family deity, who was a yaksha. And there are sculptural representations in which the yaksha is emerging from the trunk of the tree in human form and returning the compliment into the incarnate Buddha to be. This is the Buddha's own family. So the centrality of yaksha cults, the Nagas, are there almost ever present from the very beginnings, from the Mukulinda story to the protection of the relics, the Ramagrama stupa, the 8th portion that were washed into the river and guarded by the Nagas according to one version. There are multiple versions. So the Nagas play a central role as the protectors of the Buddha. And clearly they were very, very powerful, and the Buddha himself had to accommodate them in some way and work around them. Did the Buddha really want to celebrate the Naga cults? I don't think so. But he had to accommodate them, and this was done in various ways. So you get you get the yakshas guarding the four cardinal directions of the stupa plan. At Kandalahalli we had precisely that in little shrines, and you have the Nagas wrapping their bodies around the stupas in the south, and it's absolutely pervasive. And you only have to look at things like the role of the Nagas in controlling the rains, their power over the monsoon, and what did the Buddhists in the south do? They started developing the dharanis and the charms and the spells that were instrumental so that monks could control the rain. They were trying to appropriate the role of the Nagas, and this of course would give them enormous power with the local communities, who are essentially agrarian and dependent on the rains. So this imagery becomes very, very pervasive. You have the image of the Gajalakshmi, of course, and Gajalakshmi is there from the very, very beginning. She's at Udagiri and Orissa. She's in the Western Ghat rock-cut caves. She's at Kasambi. She's there at the beginning of the archaeological record. And Gajalakshmi is the best metaphor you could possibly think of for the monsoon, being lustrated by the elephants. The Buddha himself, said, I'm only my teachings. It is the Dharma. So relics, the person of the Buddha and Dharma, all interchangeable, essentially. One is just another facet of the same cut stone, and seen as a unity. But some of the canonical texts also say that the Buddha requested, in the Mahaparinirvana Sutra, he talks about the need, anticipating his own death, that he should be buried in the manner of a Chakravartin. So a spiritual king rather than a temporal one, but nonetheless, hence buried in a funerary mound appropriate to kings and people of high status, the beginnings of the stupa cult. So there's a little bit of ambiguity there in the sources. But and what the problem is trying to read back into those original sources, both the Jatakas, Avadanas, but also the paleographic, the biographical sources, which talk about the life of the Buddha. And of course, they're written centuries later, and so they're clearly massaged to appropriate to the message they want to convey. But one of the biggest challenges I think Buddhism faced is that it is rather cerebral. I mean, it really goes on in your head. So the absence of images, I think at some point probably became very challenging in terms of popular support. Hence I think we see the emergence of the Buddha image alongside the beginnings of Vasudeva, early Krishna, and Shivalinga and so on.